COVID-19 has seen an explosion of research and preprints. This panel will explore all elements of open access publishing, from preprints to rapid preprint reviews to papers as data. Please welcome moderator Adrien Perrache from the Neuro and panelists Richard Sever from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, Anna Akhmanova from Utrecht University, and Lucy Lu Wang from the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence.
Good afternoon, everyone, at least for those who are on the East Coast. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to the organizers for putting together this fantastic symposium and for all the participants. It's my pleasure today to be the moderator of this panel today, which aims to discuss open publication, which is very certainly one of the most fundamental aspects of open science. In the last 2 decades or so, the field has completely shifted, especially in biology. Remarkably, the number of published articles has exploded, so has the number of journals where to publish these papers. At the same time, many scientists now post their latest research reports on preprint servers, which means that it's posted before they are evaluated by independent peer reviewers and published in traditional journals. 2020 has been, the least to say, a trying year in many aspects. And COVID-related research has led to a barrage of studies, putting a lot of stress on the publication process, not only for scientific reasons, but also because the stakes for public health and political decisions were extremely high. So to discuss all this today, I'm delighted to welcome 3 persons whose work and vision have transformed or are still transforming the field of scientific publication. First, I want to start with you, Richard Sever. You're at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. You are the co-founder of bioRxiv and medRxiv, capital R in the two, which are perhaps the 2 leading preprint servers for biology and medical research. So could you tell us just in a few words how you ended up starting these preprint servers?
Well, I think, the real motivation was to decouple the dissemination of work from its evaluation, as you say, and really recognize that it would be a huge benefit to science to have the work out immediately. We know that everybody goes to meetings and because they want to hear the latest information. So it's basically like a meeting, but sort of 7 billion people are invited. And it puts the author in control of the dissemination, and then we can take our time to do the peer review. So that was really the motivation.
Oh, thank you. So then I'll turn to you, Anna Akhmanova. Sorry. So you're professor of cell biology at Utrecht University and deputy editor at eLife. So could you explain the audience briefly also what is eLife and how it differs from traditional scientific journals?
eLife is a journal run by scientists for scientists, and it is similar to traditional journals because it aspires to publishing excellent research and disseminating and evaluating and curating this research. But we see our most important goal is by doing what we do to try to improve publishing process at all levels we can. And this can, for example, be the way articles are peer-reviewed. For example, eLife has introduced a consultation peer review that has now been adopted by very many different journals. But we are also currently very interested in how we can link to preprint servers, which efficiently disseminate scientific literature and provide the service that we do best. And this is evaluation and peer review.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Lucy Lu Wong. You are a postdoctoral investigator at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and you are the co-developer of the Core19 database. So can you tell us a bit of what it is?
Sure. Thank you, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I work as part of the Semantic Scholar research team at the Allen Institute for AI. And the Semantic Scholar project is really like kind of a literature search engine. And we attempt to support scholars by publishing a variety of resources related to literature text mining, including data sets, as well as other tools, language models, and NLP models. And Core19, this data set, kind of falls under this kind of global goal of Semantic Scholar, which is to release a resource to support scholars in text mining. And in the case of the COVID pandemic, we wanted to kind of motivate more work, more connection between the computing and the medical communities to essentially look at the COVID-19 literature, which was being published extremely quickly through both traditional publication venues as well as preprint servers, and to try to quickly garner information from these publications.
All right, thank you. So the first topic to start generally on, preprint servers is the first topic I want to discuss is how preprints has blurred the line between, what has been peer reviewed and not peer reviewed, between preprints and publications. So how do we define, the line between the work that is accepted by the scientific community and work which is not? I mean, during this COVID-19, it's been really interesting just to hear journalists, mainstream journalists, actually referring to preprint servers for the first time, I guess. So, and I think that, begs the question, is peer review, after all, like really vital, necessary? After all, it's only 2 to 3 experts that evaluate work before publication. So is it really vital? Richard, I'd like to hear about you about this from you. What is your take on it?
Well, so I think what preprints do is they shine a light on that very question. So I think you talked about the difference between what's accepted by the scientific community and what isn't. And I think one of the things that's important to point out is there isn't a binary distinction here. I don't think even anybody from eLife would argue that if something's in a journal, it's accepted by the scientific community. We can think of papers that are retracted. We can think of papers that went down blind alleys. There are countless papers that everybody knows, they weren't on the right track and they were published. So it makes us think about that. So I think what it really shows is that, there's a point at which a scientist released some information, and then incrementally you get kind of signals around that paper that give you more trust in it. If you're an expert, you don't need that. You can just go and read it on the preprint server 24 hours later and trust yourself to make that evaluation. If you're a member of the general public, then you know it's important to be aware that this very new information has not been evaluated. If it's been published in eLife, then you know that 3 experts and an editor who really knows the field have looked at it and said, we've identified some flaws, we've hopefully ironed them out, so you can have more trust in this. But I think one thing that's very important to be clear on is that may be true of eLife, but there's a lot of predatory journals, there's a lot of other journals where it's really unclear whether or not the extent of peer review there is anywhere near comparable to something that comes out in eLife. So I think what preprints do is they kind of shine a light on this and say, we have to understand this. And that actually the critical thing when it comes to actionable scientific information is that that is not a creation of peer review, right? And one of the things that has become very clear for me throughout the COVID-19 experience is distinguishing an individual study and its merits from scientific consensus that is built up by many, many studies over time, some of which are successful, some of which fail, some of which we only know about in hindsight. And so you really need to start thinking about the fact that the validity of the scientific work is not ensured at one point in time by a peer review process.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. So Lucy, for example, in your database in the Core19, is there any difference that is made between preprints and the papers that are actually published? Is it a distinction you make in terms of like how truthful is the information?
Right. So we don't make an explicit distinction between preprints and publications, but we do provide the source of the publication. So if a paper comes from bioRxiv, medRxiv, or archive, we kind of allow the user to make the judgment that those papers are preprints. It's not always the case. A lot of papers from these archive servers are, after all, published in traditional venues with peer review. And that's something that we would like to be able to represent better, but there is no formal representation for these. We're kind of learning things as we go. We want to be able to link the eventual paper with the preprint. But it's also the case that some preprints never get published.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So Anna, you were actually saying that at eLife you're working on integrating, preprints and actual publications. So I know that there's been a lot of development lately at eLife. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes, so our vision is that in principle there is no need for traditional journals if peer reviews would be attached, for example, to papers on bioRxiv, together with, let's say, responses of the authors to these reviews, and also an improved or revised version of an article, and even maybe multiple versions of that. That is definitely possible, and many articles on bioRxiv already are represented as different versions. So, but let me make a very important distinction. I think that it is important to have papers peer-reviewed. And I totally agree with what has been said, that probably not every paper has to be peer-reviewed or will be peer-reviewed, but peer review offers huge advantages, because it's totally true what Richard said, that every journal publishes papers that are retracted, and of course 3 reviewers, when they look at the paper, can still be mistaken and miss things. But there is enormous value in 3 experts looking very carefully at a certain study, reading it very, very carefully in a concentrated manner, trying to really find out what is correctly proven, what not, which statements are true or not. This is different from an expert cursorily reading through a paper in their field and saying, yeah, that's fine, that's interesting, just picking out the message and leaving the paper out there. So there is huge value in peer review. So I think we will need it. There are other reasons that to have peer review, even if we in the end completely leave the traditional journal system behind, because, for example, for evaluation committees, faculty searchers, for a lot of different types of activities where we need to judge scientists, it's impossible to read everything that they have produced. So you need some kind of evaluation by experts, someone who will tell you this is really important, this is important for a particular field, this is something that is maybe of a relatively small importance for science in general, for the field. So this kind of work is still important. Now, the question is, how do we integrate the process where we do disseminate everything quickly by preprints? Because we do think that this is absolutely a huge, a very important step. Definitely proved itself in the COVID times when there was no time to get things peer-reviewed, but still to have a good system of actually post-publication peer review, so peer review of bioRxiv preprints. That's something that we are now at eLife thinking very deeply about. And the idea is basically to produce peer reviews at the journal for papers that are already on bioRxiv, but by peer reviewers who write them for public consumption. And that is the one very important distinction, because now peer reviews are being written for authors and editors. And if we want to have peer reviews, let's say that we leave all journals behind And we have just preprints peer-reviewed on bioRxiv, just to give an example of one specific field and one specific chunk of literature. Then what we would want our reviewers is to write reviews that would be publicly useful. And so one of the things we are very deeply thinking at eLife about is how to make this happen, how to get this process started.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thanks. So now I want to move on to the second topic, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is that, and it's become so apparent with the COVID-19. So we have seen this barrage of publication, related to this disease, and of course, knowledge about a particular phenomenon is distributed over many observations across many different labs in many different preparations. And thus, like the scientific paper, like, this PDF or pieces of paper that are put together by a team at the end now is becoming a data point by itself. So we can think of mining papers as, observation. And I think this is something absolutely new and fascinating that is happening in the field. So, Lucy, this is particularly true, for what you're doing with the Core-19 dataset. So what makes it possible? I guess, of course, open publishing is important, but also, so what are the limits to this approach currently?
I think some of the earlier points raised here are very relevant. Rapid publishing of preliminary results, and then subsequent updating of those results when new information comes to light makes this possible, right? With something like the pandemic, we see that information changes over time, and also the information needs of clinicians and public health officials also changes over the time. The questions they're trying to ask change over time. So we really tried to capture this not only in the data set by making it, daily updated data set, the Core-19 data set, but also we ran some challenges to try to demonstrate this in practice. So the Trek COVID challenge was kind of a retrieval challenge that we ran on the Core-19 data set, where we looked at the evolution of different scientific questions over time, and also looked at whether the answers changed when new publications arose and things like that. And it's a really interesting question. It's not really something we have an answer to, but certainly trying to capture not just new information, but how information changes over time is, I think, like an open challenge for the community.
So when we think about like what makes it possible, of course we're thinking about all these algorithms that can parse, information on the web. So, for example, Richard, at bioRxiv and medRxiv, what authors are just asked to fill in in forms is just the title and the abstract, but the PDF, the paper themselves, have no required format. You can submit whatever pieces of PDF to that. So, is it a problem or for data mining, as the Core-19 initiative is doing? Have you thought about it, Richard, for bioRxiv to basically ask for some requirement in terms of how the PDF are made so that they can be parsed and mined?
Well, so a couple of things. We also convert all the PDFs we convert into HTML and XML. And so XML papers are structured, and bioRxiv has a dedicated text and data mining repository where we put all the XML so people can go and do that. So I don't think that's really a challenge, and we're rolling out the same thing for medRxiv. So I think you can do. I think the challenge really is the technology. We hear a lot about machine learning, AI, etc., and there are a lot of promises. That text mining will deliver things, but I think we're not quite there yet. And hopefully initiatives like bioRxiv will allow us to do that, will allow people to kind of like use these things as training sets and start learning. And I would just echo that earlier point about the longitudinal problem, how things happen with time. And one thing that we all know as scientists is that data aren't really very democratic. There are some good papers and there are some bad papers. So I always joke that, if you have 100 papers that say the world is flat, and then somebody comes along and publishes a paper saying the world is round, you can't just sort of say, oh, I've got 101 papers, the majority of them say it's flat, right? So I think that's something that's going to be a challenge for the text minds, and that's what's really interesting to me in how you solve that longitudinal problem with how information changes over time. And, coming to the real world, you see this with small studies that come out saying that there's some effect of the drug on COVID-19, like the early studies, some coming out saying that like hydroxychloroquine might have some effect, and then the evidence mounts it, and basically you get to a point where it's pretty clear that you shouldn't be prescribing hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19 because it doesn't work. We've done the sort of gold standard randomized controlled trials now.
I see. So what is also very obvious, during these COVID times is that papers have been published at an amazing pace. Every week we see new papers coming up, and clearly that suggests that the decision process, the reviewing process for these papers have been very sped up by editors, and certainly reviewers were asked to review it more faster than usual. So Anna, is it something that you've been confronted to at eLife, making sure that these important data, because it's related to something that is so important right now, are published faster than usual other kind of biological papers?
Absolutely. What we have done when the pandemic started is start a kind of a consultation group of several senior editors representing broad expertise from epidemiology, virology, infectious disease to structural molecular biology, evolutionary biology. And what we did is have every COVID paper coming in evaluated by several senior editors very quickly. I must say that, and this I think has been also noticed by other journals, there were a lot of submissions that were not of very high quality, although probably useful to be disseminated on bioRxiv, but not worthy of in-depth rapid peer review. And what we try to do is identify within, let's say, 1-2 days papers that were worth having peer reviewed, and then having those peer reviewed thoroughly. And there, I must say, we didn't try to put extensive pressure on our reviewers to, of course, everyone realized that speed is important, but we thought that because all this content can in principle be disseminated thanks to excellent work of bioRxiv, medRxiv, so in principle it's out in the open, so that our job was to select the papers that are should be peer reviewed and are important, and peer review those well, so that if we finally decide to publish them, that we can vouch for their quality. This was the choice we made, and I think that is what worked well for us. One thing I want to add about the data discussion is what eLife is also trying to do is to be very careful to have all the data associated with the papers out there in the public. This is particularly important for medical papers, where sometimes data accessibility can be complicated, and this is something that we continue to work on to see how to make this better, because in the end, of course, data mining is about having not so much the conclusions that the authors attach to whatever data they have, but the data themselves. And so those have to be very transparent and also somehow available in a format that is useful for mining.
I see. And we agree, Richard, that there's no such requirement at Bio or medRxiv, right? So it's just a paper and no requirement about the data being available when the paper is published. Is it something actually you thought about?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think one of the points you made earlier was the stress on the system. And the publishing system is under great stress because of COVID-19. And so what bioRxiv and medRxiv, in a way, is they relieve that stress because of the decoupling, right? So what you can do is you can disseminate the information and then allow the kind of necessary, thorough process of peer review at somewhere like eLife to happen. And I certainly don't want to give you the impression that decoupling peer review from dissemination means that we don't think you should do peer review. We definitely think you should. I mean, the form may change depending on the content, but what you can't do is try and then do everything that a journal does at the preprint server stage. So, you know, I mean, if you, for example, you take the case of the kind of process that eLife would go through to make sure that the data are.
Oh, so I think we lost Richard, at least on my end. Yes. Okay, so no problem. Like, just waiting for Richard to reconnect. I wanted to basically think of one last question for Lucy. So we've been talking about, you know, being papers, meaning the claims, the statements, the analysis, the details being published in the paper that are parsed by all these machine learning algorithm and by the database that you're working on. But so what about the data that are attached? Is it something also? Are you trying to link the two in the way your database is built, meaning it's both the statement and also the data, so that if someone can basically see if it matches? It's like, how do you deal with that when building such a database?
Right. So we would, of course, love to do that. We'd love to be able to link all types of resources to these papers, including the original data set, as well as for example, any presentations, any other like supplementary materials that are available. Hi, Richard, welcome back. But I think in terms of linking data, this is definitely an additional challenge. We have certain I guess certain links are provided in the current Cord19 database, but because we focus primarily on text mining, we don't currently provide those links. This seems like a great, interesting problem. There's a couple of databases out there that I think do this, like DataMed, I think, is a database that indexes data sets for search. If we could, for example, link to that, that could be a great contribution.
I see. Thank you. So before we actually start with the last topic, I just want to tell the audience, if you're still not familiar, that you can ask question, and we'll actually spend some time at the end answering this question. You can even vote for a question that have been asked by others if you also agree with this question. So I want to give you the opportunity to do it now while we're finishing the discussion. So the last topic I want to talk about now is how do we improve publication practices? And of course, I think, as usual, the question is about incentive. So how do we, really convince people to publish preprints? Many people still don't. Can we only count on goodwill? Of course, the number of preprints keeps on increasing, but how also the system keep up with this space? Because we need people to actually make sure it works. So I don't know, perhaps Richard, you want to start? I know that during the COVID, your servers have, seen a lot of posts. So how did you deal with that?
Well, I mean, so in terms of the incentives for people to post preprints, I think the important thing, and this is what people began to realize with medRxiv, because bear in mind that the bioRxiv is 7 years old, whereas medRxiv is only just over a year old. So medRxiv had only begun 6 months when COVID happened. It was people in the clinical sphere were very unfamiliar with the practice. But one of the things that you see with archive and then you see with bioRxiv and now medRxiv is once a field starts posting preprints, they never go back. And the reason for that is that there's a benefit to the individual and there's a benefit to the community. And it's much easier to incentivize people to do something if they get something out of it. So clearly it's a benefit to science for people to share early, but also it's a benefit to the author because it means that they can put a stake in the ground saying, I did this on this day. And you really have to emphasize this point, that because of the preprint, it means that the author is in total control of the timing. Once you go to peer review, then you don't know. You've got somewhere between 36 days and 3 years. And as the author, you really can't control that. You know that the median is going to be about 7 months, but I have a slide deck where I show papers that have been 5 years in peer review. Whereas if you post a preprint, you can get it out within 24 to 48 hours. You can put it on your resume. You can apply for the job or the grant or the tenure position that's coming up next week, and you have a paper that you can show, and you can show the papers there, and it's citable. So I think I think once people realize that, then they tend to, then it's very, I don't think people start posting preprint and then change their mind and decide that's a bad idea. So I think it's just getting that message out, and we've seen it, in bioRxiv, we saw it in genomics, in neuroscience, in molecular biology, and now we're seeing it in the clinical sphere.
I see. Really, really interesting points. So at eLife, and it's like, what kind of incentive are you thinking of just to make sure that people contribute? Being editor, requires a lot of time. Being a reviewer also requires a lot of time. So what do you think is the right incentive for you at eLife, but also in relationship with the community, the organization, the universities, to make sure that this time is recognized? So what is your take on it?
Yeah, first of all, as a journal, of course, you can make a very simple incentive for people to post preprints. You can just tell the authors that we will not review your paper unless it is posted as a preprint. And that's exactly what eLife plans to do in some foreseeable future. Not immediately, but we see that as our future. We will be reviewing preprints. Now, why don't we switch to this immediately? That's because another core value of eLife is to taking all communities along. And we do see that adoptance of preprints differs between different scientific communities, but also between different geographic communities, for example. And we definitely want to understand this better and work with these communities before we move towards only reviewing preprints. Now, how do we do that? So what we think is very, very important, just to tell you one thing about eLife. eLife is set up and strongly funded by funders. And so we think that funders and universities have a role in promoting preprints. For example, by accepting preprints on grant proposals, on CVs for promotion, and that needs to be broadly adopted worldwide, because as Richard pointed out, that's when there are significant advantages for the authors to submit their papers on a preprint server. And the adoptance of this kind of use of preprint varies around the world. So in some parts of the world, this is very general, and other parts of the world it lags behind. So this is something to work with these funders and these communities. But definitely at eLife, we think that the future is with reviewing preprints, and we just need to convince the different communities, funders, everybody to use them. And one more important thing, if we move towards reviewed preprints, so let's say having reviews on bioRxiv for the preprint, then also these different communities, but also funders, universities, should make perhaps a distinction between reviewed and not reviewed preprint, but accept reviewed preprints at the value which they would now attach to paper published in a traditional journal. And that's something that needs to evolve and be worked out further. But if we make that step, then it seems that that's when we could depart from the traditional publishing system and move to the system where we first disseminate on an archive, then peer review, and then based on that curate the literature.
I see. Thanks. Thank you. So I guess that there are still, like going back to the COVID-19, there are still many papers that are not posted on preprints, and that perhaps will appear, even if it's quickly, on very high-profile journals. However, this data would have served the community if it had been posted even a month before their publication. So do you think, Lucy, that like a database search as the COVID-19 is an incentive, showing the community, say, look, please participate by posting this data or these reports on preprint servers. They will be part of the database and they will be accessible immediately to the community. And have you felt actually anything like this happening?
Well, I can definitely comment kind of more broadly on the individual benefits of publishing preprints. So I kind of have been in both the computer science and the biomedical community for a while, so I've seen the different relationships that these groups have to their preprint servers. And in a earlier, like Richard said, once you start publishing preprints, you just don't really go back because there's individual benefit. We conducted a study looking at kind of archive preprints and found that people who released their papers first on a preprint servers tended to get more citations and engagement down the road to comparable papers. And this is probably a phenomenon that we'll start seeing for all varieties of preprint servers. In addition to this kind of individual benefit, I think this is a benefit to the journals where eventually these publications will be released as well. There's just more time for the community to offer both consensus and kind of like an interpretation of the value of the study. But maybe more on a like devil's advocate note, I think like there's also a kind of pretty odd behavior that can start happening with the rise of preprint servers. So in computer science, this is something that we've seen, which is in some cases, certain organizations find that they no longer need to publish in a peer-reviewed venue once the preprint servers become so established that people go to those preprint servers and rely on them for kind of the latest studies. And this really has the potential of maybe exacerbating something like the Matthew effect, which for those unfamiliar, it's kind of like the rich get richer effect, where instead of relying on peer review or journals as a signal for the quality of a paper, people might rely on other signals like familiarity with the author or the institution or things like that. So this is something that I think is really also something we need to balance, right? Preprints are clearly like very valuable, but how do we integrate them into the greater body of scientific work?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. So I now want to basically get to the question that have been asked, and there are many of them on right now. So I quickly read, and there's some overlap between this question, but I think one central topic here that I feel is, and we talked about it somehow, and actually it was a subject of the previous panel, but let's talk a bit about it more, is what could journals and preprint servers do to make it easier to mine them? And should we actually include what Baron Mons in the previous panel suggested, meaning fair supplementary data readable by machines? And that was a central point of his of this discussion, is that there should be like highly precisely formatted data in the supplementary, called it supplementary articles, that should be readable by machines so that they can be mined. So if any one of you wants to comment on this question or answer?
I mean, so one thing I can this is a challenge that journals face and preprint servers face, and I think one thing to point out is that in communities where where mining of data and analysis of data is a very important aspect, there are already dedicated databases. So, you know, you have NCBI, you have EBI for genomic sequences. Nobody would think for a second of putting, you know, a genome sequence as a data supplement to a paper. If you're an X-ray crystallographer, you have PDB, which has dedicated functionality for dealing with atomic coordinates. So I think one thing you have to be very careful of is thinking that the paper is everything. The paper is a narrative about some conclusions drawn from a series of experiments. And I think one of the questions is where did the data behind that paper lie? I mean, we know that, you know, if you're a cell biologist, you have a representative figure, but you could have taken 20,000 images. Where do you put those? So I think there's a rush to put everything in supplementary data. And the danger of that is that the way you structure that supplementary data, will you try to be all things to all people, or is it much better to have them in a very networked ecosystem where you go to something like a preprint or a paper and it says, okay, here, there's a crystal structure. I'm going to ping you over to PDB, where the database, and we already do this for genomic information. We already do it for X-ray crystallography. The question is, how much other information do we do that for? I mean, it's okay to put a sequence alignment in a supplementary data file. I guess I'm less convinced that structured supplementary data is the solution to this problem. I think linking to resources elsewhere, like if people have Jupyter notebooks, may be a better way to do it.
I see. So at eLife, how is it managed actually? Is anything done really to make it easier in terms of supplementary data? So it's a requirement to post the data online, but it's not, the data are not hosted by eLife. So what kind of requirements do you actually have for authors when they publish a paper in terms of how data should be published, but also formatted, perhaps?
Yeah, so we are still struggling with that. So we do ask the authors to submit with their paper the simple numerical data, like the numbers that underlie their plots, so that people can replot their data, play with the data points and things like that. So this doesn't take too much space, and we ask for that. For the specialized type of data, like Richard mentioned, so we absolutely ask connection to relevant databases, and that's, I think, all journals do that now, so that for those types of data, I think the problems are solved. The biggest problem lies with the data that do not easily sort themselves on a particular type of databases. So, and people in the field are thinking deeply about having more databases. Let's take cell biology, for example. Now, there are a lot of data, like you said, there is one image that goes into the paper, 20,000 images that maybe you have analyzed to get the plot, so you can put the numbers, but what do you do with these images? How many people would want to look at them? How much effort do you want to keep them available online? Because we are talking about huge volumes of data. So these are actually unsolved questions. We are very interested in them. And of course, eLife cannot solve them for the community. The community have to come up with solutions. But we do ask for, like, for example, all the data that is easily accessible, to make that accessible.
I see. Well, thank you. So we have like not even 2 minutes left. So I just want to ask each of you, like in 30 seconds, to tell us, how do you envision the future of publication? And maybe I would start with you, Lucy, because what you're doing to me really looks like the future. So how do you see it changing, in the next 10 years?
Right. I think we have a lot to look forward to. Clearly, there's a lot of value in open sharing of both data and publication results in a accessible format. I think open access publications are on the rise, and they will continue to be. I think that is the future. I think linking preprints to peer review is a very interesting problem. And then finally, just like weighing in very quickly on this, how to make articles better for machine reading. Like, the volume of publications has just grown phenomenally over the last couple decades, and especially more recently. And we're going to need more automated methods of either summarizing the literature, identifying relevant results, things like that. And right now we have some things in place, some standardized formats to help make this easier. I think both eLife and bioRxiv, medRxiv provide their data in a more structured format, XML or HTML. But those are structured formats, but they're not always standardized. So there's this additional issue of how do we standardize within a particular format, and I think that's the question that we need to solve next.
Sure, thanks, Richard. What is your next adventure in the preprint world?
I think it's probably the next adventure is not for us. It's what we want to enable. I mean, the decoupling that I spoke of allows eLife to do the experiments in peer review. So I guess what I see the future of is that peer review becomes much more multidimensional, more multifaceted. Doesn't happen necessarily at one point in time, and someone like eLife and other groups can basically have a broader cloud of events of analysis. And they can do that because we've already put the paper out on bioRxiv. So I think that's what I see, is that hopefully bioRxiv is just the start that allows other people to say, hey, look, bioRxiv have already dealt with dissemination. Now we can really tackle the evaluation and make peer review better than it was before, rather than replace it.
Okay, thanks. And so Anna, is eLife the future of publication?
No, if we want to precipitate the future in which the journal name of the journal where the paper is published is not the descriptor of the quality or other properties of the paper. I think the community at large recognizes that we need to move away from that. We don't know how, but definitely we want to be one of the vehicles to make that possible.
Okay. Thank you very, very much to all of you for this panel. That was fascinating, very interesting. And again, thank you to the organizers of this symposium. And let's continue for, 1.5 days of great open science. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.